All right, thanks everybody for showing up. I hope everybody had a productive day. I heard a lot about IoT, banking, threats, risks, mobile apps, IAM, CIAM, SOS, but right now we're going to wrestle with the gorilla, passwords. And I think we're closer than we've ever been to really turning a corner. And I think we can push this, or we're going to see if we can push this across the line and how much pushing it's going to take. Our panel, we've got Brett McDowell, Executive Director of Phyto Alliance, Loveless Chabra, who is the VP of ID Platforms at Oath, Dean Sachs, a Security Engineer at Amazon, and Brad Hill, who's Engineering Lead at Facebook. So we're going to jump right into it. We got 30 minutes of identity brain food, and then you can all go wash it down with a cold beverage. So, Brett, I'm going to start with you. FIDO's been in the news a lot. You've been in the news a lot. A lot of stuff is going on there, so why don't you, fill us in, tell us about progress you've had towards retiring passwords and some of the successes you've had, some of the challenges you guys are facing.
Great. Thanks, John. So, FIDO, if you haven't figured it out yet, today at this conference is an acronym, Fast Identity Online. It's an open industry standard developed by a nonprofit group called the Phyto Alliance. Which is a membership organization, and we exist to supplant the world's dependencies on passwords. This couldn't be a better topic for me to talk to you about today. So I'll talk about kind of plans and progress and problems or challenges. So first, the plan. FIDO would just be on every internet-connected device. That's essentially the mission. It has to be as ubiquitous as passwords. And the FIDO model is to move off that password credential to this cryptographic credential. And so I think it's helpful to think about it in the abstract as a credential. If we're going to talk about passwords, it's like, well, what is a password in the context and in the use cases? So if you're not going to have a shared secret credential anymore, then what are you going to replace it with? So our idea is bind that to your device. You've got an internet-connected device. You probably have lots of them. You're going to have more and more of them in your life with IoT. And so that's the plan. Progress is that standardization-wise, we've had some of the standards in market and with certified implementations of those standards since 2015. And now, this year, big milestone with FIDO2, where we're standardizing both the device-side standards in the Phyto Alliance and the web platform standards in the W3C. So everything that you need to know for your web server, your web application, and the web browser, that part of it is WebAuthn. That's part of FIDO2 that's standardized by the W3C. So we're coming to the platform. It's being implemented in Android and Chrome, Firefox. We're even seeing signs it's being implemented in Safari. And of course, Windows 10, Windows Hello. So that's the progress. It's getting on those devices. And Google's doing a cool thing, and you can find out more from them on their booth. They're implementing in Google Play Services so that you get multiple generations of Android, not just Android P. And then problems and challenges. Well, as all of you know that work in identity and access management, credential lifecycle management end to end. So there are still ends to this cycle that are not so neat and clean and problem solved. Identity proofing. How do we figure out that it's really Brett McDowell on the other end? If Brett loses all of his FIDO devices, how do I get Brett back into his account? That's the next challenge. That's the frontier that we really have to tackle next.
All right, thanks. Dean, I'm going to go to you next.
Sure.
And so when we think about this modernized authentication, what do we need to do to modernize the other pieces of the identity stack? And how long a project of that is that, and how long does it?
So the TLDR is, it's a long project. Brett queued it up really well, though. One of the biggest problems in the enterprise space, which is where I work, is how do we bind that user to the authenticator? How do we do so in a strong manner? If you're using a password today and you go register your YubiKey or other FIDO device with that password, you haven't established any strong binding there of the user to that device. And so that becomes a real challenge for enterprises in how to roll those out. It's fairly straightforward, I think, when you have a new hire orientation type of scenario. So new users are coming in, they're presenting documents to verify their identity, et cetera, here in the States, like an I-9. So that's a great opportunity to onboard those users onto those tokens. But for those users who exist in the company today, do you want to go redo that identity proofing? For users who lose their tokens, what happens then? I have heard stories of people being multiple hours away from an office and they lose a token. Well, how do they get bootstrapped back into that ecosystem in a secure manner? And I don't think we have good answers to that yet. But the Enterprise Working Group, I think that's what the new name is, at FIDO, is going to be tackling that problem. So I think that's really the biggest area that we've got to deal with. And then we've got to look at what are the business drivers around this. In some cases, it may be that certain parts of the business can't use a USB-A or USB-C style token. You have employees in a retail store, they're on a floor, and they just need to be able to go very rapidly. Maybe they just need like a FIDO 2 device with NFC, touch and go with first factor authentication, as opposed to multi-factor authentication. But every business is going to have to make a decision as to what their risk tolerance is and how they're going to use that risk tolerance to inform their decisions about what kind of devices they're going to use, what mode they're going to use them in, and how they register the users to them.
All right. Brad, I'll got one for you. You see authentication develop from a perspective of a large consumer service. What are you learning about improving authentication, and what are the shortfalls and some of the strengths that that you're seeing?
Sure, John. So, I work on the login with Facebook side of things rather than the login to Facebook side of things. So from that point of view, we're kind of already in a post-password world. We've had almost 10 years now of logging in hundreds of millions of people to millions of applications without passwords. And sort of the journey's not over once you get there. You have the utility benefits, you have the security benefits, you have the ease of use benefits of not having passwords in the way, but you have to make sure you're very careful about balancing those against privacy, control, transparency, and trust. I'm going to go against the grain a little bit for an identity conference and say often what we need to be doing is using less identity, especially in these consumer use cases. I think FIDO set a really good example. Even though identity is in the name, the actual protocol is identityless. It's just an authenticator, and that really takes away a lot of friction, a lot of risk, a lot of potential pain on the privacy and trust side of things from using those protocols. So a lot of what we're doing is looking at how do we go back to those first principles and really examine the actual scenarios, what are the problems and opportunities facing businesses and people, and how can we use our platform to enable better experiences for people without necessarily sharing as much identity data. A business maybe doesn't need to know and strongly bind that it's me, Brad, that's going to make this transaction, as long as they can get a signal that I'm a trustworthy person and not a malicious bot. Or maybe we can connect people between online and offline experiences as individuals without necessarily revealing a lot of that information to the businesses involved. So looking for ways where we can attenuate data, looking for ways where we can be more privacy aware, and not just sort of sprinkle this amorphous concept of identity on top of everything. Think really carefully about how we're using and sharing that data.
All right. Love the show. Oath has been making some updates to its consumer strategy for authentication lately, and so fill us in on why and what they are and what you're learning from your work.
Right. So from an identity perspective, Oath has two sort of large consumer-facing brands. One is Yahoo, one is AOL, right? So I'll touch on each of these sort of one at a time. Both of these systems organically grew to be somewhat independent and different from each other. So within the Yahoo space, a couple of years ago, we launched our first sort of foray into passwordless auth with the Yahoo account key, right? That delegates trust to your mobile device. You register your mobile device with your account, and then that becomes your anchor or your credential, as we called it, right? It becomes your credential. You can say yes or no to a future login from a browser or whatnot. It was also sort of early days of us as an industry trying to move away from passwords in the consumer ecosystem. So it was done entirely on our proprietary technologies, proprietary protocols, because the standards weren't ready yet, right? Now, as the standards are getting there, more browsers are adopting it. We're also looking at how we sort of triangulate from that point of view to adopting or coming over to the standards side. So that's sort of the Yahoo ecosystem. right? AOL as a system also organically grew, did things on sort of a different format than Yahoo did. AOL adopted standards much sooner, actually, and stuck to standards. So AOL as a technology set for identity didn't attempt an account key type product. But as of right now, we've merged. We formed the company last year. We just celebrated our first birthday last week. So as of right now, we've combined the technologies. So we've done sort of a user experience modernization, if you will, for AOL users. We brought them over to the same technology stack that runs Yahoo Identity and every other brand under the Oath umbrella. So that modernization effort for that user base was actually a fast project for us. We did it in a year. And I say fast sort of heavily there because prior to building Yahoo Account Key, I had to modernize the Yahoo Auth stack. That was one of my sessions a couple of years ago at Cloud Identity Summit. And that was a multi-year with a large team kind of a project. It's not easy to modernize the engineering pieces, the technology behind it, right? But once you have a system that works, morphing it to get ready for yet another brand is somewhat of a simpler transaction, right? So that's why simpler transaction done in a year, right? But now, as we look at adopting more standards, audiences on both sides of the house will get it at the same time. It's not going to be that a feature set is available to Yahoo users but not available to AOL users. Right, we're looking at also contributing back to standards and sort of pushing the standards forward where they are not yet ready or not yet at a point where they meet our business needs.
So tell me what sort of standards, I mean, what are the standards that you're looking at, that you're focused on?
Well, FIDO is one for U2F, to begin with U2F and then sort of move on to the first factor as needed, right? Because right now the reliance is heavily on either a mobile app on your device that does the account key sort of handoff. If for some reason the app's not working, you uninstalled it or whatnot, we fail over to SMS, which we all know isn't great, right? But if for whatever reason SMS fails, you fail over to email, which I wouldn't go great detail into, but I know that it converts much lower than SMS. It's not great from a user experience perspective, right? So we want to keep the user experience as simple and as relevant to today's technology as we can, right? And that's where I think FIDO has a huge role to play. And that I expect a sort of implementation soon. I can't say when, but it'll come.
Right. But you want to comment on that? I mean, ease of use, I mean, that's a FIDO theme.
That's a mantra, yeah. So those of us involved in founding the Phyto Alliance knew that we're wasting our time if we just came up with better security. We had to come up with less steps for the user. I personally was involved had responsibility for our two-factor authentication offering at the company I was working for at the time, and I saw the opt-in rates were embarrassingly low. So whenever you ask that user, if you ask them straight up, do you want to be more secure? Yes. You want to type in this code? No. So we learned from that. And so we knew we had to take steps out of the flow if we wanted to introduce this better security model. And what was great is that we were just able to kind of jump on the trend at the time, which was biometrics showing up on devices. And, oh, this is a nice way to do local user verification, very privacy preserving. And all we really need to do is have that user prove they're the same user that registered their credential. FIDO takes care of the heavy lifting, which is the crypto underneath. And so we're kind of just able to point to that and make sure that that would all interoperate so there's an abstraction layer. And what's nice for all of you is that we didn't pick a modality. We didn't standardize, thou shalt do fingerprint, thou shalt do face or voice. It's an abstraction layer. So industry can continue to innovate, and it will and it must, to follow the user and just give them choice. So when I hear executives who have bankrolled their FIDO investment, they talk about, we did this to enable user choice, to enable customer choice. It's the first thing out of their mouth.
And that's interesting because from an enterprise perspective, I see it a little differently. Not about, it's not customer choice, it's user choice at this point. But again, it gets back to that idea that different users have very different use cases in how they're going to use their authenticators on a daily basis. If I'm a knowledge worker and I have a laptop in front of me with a USB, it's great. I've got that opportunity. If I've got certain devices that I can use NFC with, that's awesome. But then we look at more specific use cases where people are out in the field, they're running around, they're in their cars all day, like, you know, you're selling insurance or you work for the city or whatever. Those use cases, they're going to have very different kinds of authenticators they're going to need in order to make it successful and give them that right user experience. And that's where I think we need to look toward that differentiation of authenticators in this space, because there's not a one-size-fits-all answer now.
So, I mean, I think part of what you're saying is that the elimination of passwords maybe doesn't happen. We're talking about use cases, and that a use case could be a password depending on, you know, what's being protected.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, there are cases where, in my mind, passwords are going to be very hard to get rid of. They're not great authenticators. We know they're poor authenticators, but they're the default. They're easy, and I have to say I'm a bit of a dissenter here that there's going to be a very long tail to get rid of those passwords. But we work, you know, we start with the most security conscious applications, the most security conscious things that we're doing, whether it's banking or financials or healthcare or whatever that is. Obviously in the enterprise space, it's more directed toward the enterprise. But if we start there and then work backwards and get users into the habit, I think we can be quite successful.
Yeah, just to clarify, the title of the panel is Towards a Future Without Passwords, but I think the real call to action is add better authentication, like add it. Don't worry about what you're going to take away, add a better option. Better security, better risk management for you, and better user experience for your user base, whether they're enterprise or consumer. Absolutely. That's the way to think about this FIDO movement, and what do I do now that web browsers and operating systems support this new standard? Just add it, just support it. And then, you know, your users can opt in, and you don't have to take anything away. I do think it's going to be a long tail before we get rid of this notion of a shared secret knowledge-based bootstrap into an account, because what are you going to do to replace it? Now, there's pockets around the world that this conversation is going to go very differently. They're not going to be talking about FIDO. They're going to be talking about match-on-server biometrics. You know, and that is the, you know, the new hotness in various markets around the world, and that's what they're focused on. It's like, all right, just collect those biometrics and put them on the, you know, in a giant database. You know, we don't, you know, we've never heard of a data breach happening, right? So, but the truth is that's going to happen. That's going to happen, and we as the Phyto Alliance understand that's going to happen, and we're looking at how do we be complementary in those environments where they're using match-on-server biometrics for identification. They still benefit from using on-device crypto for authentication. So countries like, you know, most famously in India, what they're doing, but also China and some other emerging countries. So it's more about adding this new capability, and don't get hung up on killing off the password.
I think the password becomes, it's no longer a security boundary. It could be used to signal I want to get into some site, and then you have to produce some other credential, which would be crypto or something better. But I don't, Brett.
And passwords can be done well with increasing prevalence of password managers built into browsers, built into platforms, things like that. I think the other big opportunity here is we sort of have these habits and these rails that we've thought about authentication for a long time, and we've been on about, okay, we have username and password, and username is probably an email, and then the email is used for recovering it if you forget your password, or you send an SMS to recover the account. And disrupting the password is part of disrupting the whole way we think about that system, and disrupting all of those legacy technologies. Because it's great to have an authenticator that's privacy preserving, but if you make the username be an email address, then you've immediately thrown away all that privacy again. Or phone numbers. You know, one of the big driving factors for implementing U2F at Facebook was providing a strong authentication mechanism for people who didn't want to share a phone number because they're journalists, they're activists, or, you know, they just have privacy concerns about sharing their phone number. So I think it's an opportunity to disrupt and also start thinking about how do we rebuild these supporting services that Brett talked about at the ends of the ecosystem, account recovery being a really important one that we've been trying to work on at Facebook, and make open standards for doing bidirectionally anonymous strong account recovery that's of equivalent security to the sort of enhanced second factors that we have coming out of FIDO. How do we do with usernames in the future if we don't want to have them be instantly linkable to data brokers and the black market and abusable by bad actors? What's the future of usernames? I know FIDO 2 has some options for that, but again, if you lose your device, how do you remember what your username was if it's not your email address? So there's this whole umbra of things we have to think about in terms of privacy, and end-to-end lifecycle management, where the password is just sort of the first bad habit to break, and it's going to make us think about everything else that we're doing.
So, you know, we see the password on the front end, but, you know, just because we change the authenticator doesn't mean we have to change, or that we don't have to touch the management and other things that happen in the back end. So, I mean, Dean, you touched on this. It's like it's not just as easy as replacing the authenticator with something else. There's all the management considerations.
Yeah, the business processes must change with it. Your business process has to support these new types of authenticators and how, again, we get them bootstrapped. You know, back to the loss scenario, do we use trusted referees? If so, how do we build that group of trusted referees and have them every place in the world where we might have somebody lose an authenticator? Is that even a workable, scalable model? I don't really know. But it's certainly better than a model of, you know, call up your boss and have them reset your password. Businesses may have to make the decision that at some point, if they're using strong authentication everywhere, they're using FIDO protocols everywhere, there may be a business decision that if you lose or break all of your authenticators and you're remote, you may just be offline for a while. And that's a reasonable decision to make from a risk standpoint, but it's probably a hard pill for many companies to swallow.
Lovelich, how do you think about this? Go.
So I was going to go next anyways on this one, right? You can do that. You can think like that or have an approach like that for enterprise users. For consumers, for somebody who's traveling, let's say from America to Paris, like from here to Boston to Paris and on a vacation, they need to print their, you know, their event tickets, their show, concert tickets or whatever. They need to get to their email now, right? We can't turn around and say, well, you left your YubiKey home, so thank you very much. Like it can't work like that, right? So we have to have the life cycle figured out. And I think parts of it are there and parts of it are going to get there over the next 12 to 24 months is my sort of sense for where this is.
Are they going to get there with standards, do you think, or is that something that's proprietary?
No, I'm looking more at standards to help solve it. I think one company trying to solve the entire life cycle is going to be extremely isolated and may not scale as much as we need it to scale as an industry, right? If there is a way to manage this life cycle such that you can get to your Facebook, your Google, your Yahoo, your every other account, consumers are likely to opt in. I opt into one service, I use it, I realize, oh, this works, oh, and this can also be used on my other accounts. It drives up the user experience, the security for the entire ecosystem. Versus I built something just for one service that the user uses from me, right? And it's not going to be compatible with other products. They're not likely to opt in. And those opt-in rates that he talks about for second factor auth were dismal for the whole internet. He wasn't unique in experiencing that, right? We have to break that shell. We have to get them to adopt. So,
all right. So the trade-offs are going to need to be made, and you know, as we move beyond passwords, all the destinations aren't going to be utopian. I mean, do you see? I mean, can you pull out one or two things where you really see there might be some issues?
So I'll talk about it, you know, a couple of things. When people start adding this into your systems, and you know, you compare that, you know, all the sophisticated sites, they're going to have a risk-based authentication backend, and this technology doesn't replace that. This is just another signal into that system, and it's a different kind of signal. It's very strong. It's a cryptographic verification of what's on the other end. But you're going to score that, and you're going to learn how to score that differently over time. So you're probably going to be able to measure, all right, transactions using this particular, you know, credential authentication context, those are really high assurance. I'm not going to really think about any kind of step up there, or I'm going to have different policy about when to step up. But then if someone doesn't have it, you're not going to lock them out of their account. You're going to let them get back into their account, but you're going to score those sessions much lower. You know, just like we let users that have nothing but a password log in from their brand new machine, right? They get a new device, you let them log in, you want them to use the service on their new device, but you don't have any of that context to score that well, so you're going to score that as an unknown, untrusted device. And maybe some services will put them through an extra step up when they see a fresh device. So I think that's the way to think about how to fit this new technology into your, you know, your portfolio. So there's one new thing, it's got different characteristics, it's got less vulnerability to the attacks you're normally fighting off, and so you're going to score it differently, and then over time, when the percentage of your users are always showing up with this technology as the standards percolate, well, now I can start putting even more pressure on these less trusted contexts. I can have them step up through, because it's happening less often, and it kind of works for them and it works for us. And I think that's how you're going to see the weaker credentials get pushed out of the system over time. Users aren't going to want to use them, and when you have to fall back to those, you're going to put them through more questions.
So it's interesting that you bring that up, because one of the questions I have is, how do we actually get consumers to take on using a FIDO device, whether it's U2F or FIDO2, whatever it is. And Brad and I were having this conversation earlier, as well as there was an interesting conversation on Twitter earlier today about, do companies provide these to their users, like their internal users, their internal staff? Here's a FIDO device, use this to log into all the things internally in company X, and now, oh, by the way, this is yours, you keep it, you should go use this on Google, Dropbox, Facebook, all the other places. It was interesting, the Twitter conversation kind of went two different ways, with some people saying, keep those things separate, it belongs to the company. I think that it shouldn't belong to the company. It's a cheap device, I hand it to you, it's yours. It's a benefit to you, and it's a benefit to me when you secure all of your online accounts.
Brad, any?
Yeah, I mean, it's the price of a t-shirt. And attackers don't just attack your systems. They're going to go after your employees. They're going to go after your high-value users at their email account. If you're a software shop, they're going to go after your personal GitHub account. So it's really a great bargain for companies to say, here's a couple $1 device. It's yours to keep. Please go secure the rest of your personal digital ecosystem, because the bad guys are going to try and come at you through all of those places, not just the IT systems that we control and manage directly.
All right, I see we're kind of running out of time. I just kind of had a gut check question for you guys. I wonder if we're just kind of a little loopy on optimism here for all this stuff, and we've been here before, and it didn't work out as planned to get over this hurdle. So, I mean, any thoughts on that?
So that's what it was key on day one with at least the FIDO effort, was make sure that there's a compelling value prop to the user. We also had to solve the distribution problem. So with FIDO now showing up in every web browser and every internet-connected device, not tomorrow, but we're getting there. And we are getting to every web browser tomorrow, by the way. I think every web browser will ship a FIDO-enabled version before the end of the year. So it really is ubiquitous on the client support side, right around the corner. So the question is, with that solved, how do you get the user to go through that step? Because you still have to ask them, would you like to do this instead? Because you have to do a registration flow. You have to coax them into a registration flow. It's a pretty simple one, but you have to get them through it. And the value prop is your life's going to be easier. Not you're going to be more secure, your life's going to be easier. And then, of course, with these security keys, there's also that added proposition, and you're going to be more secure. And I think one of the hidden propositions is, I'm going to be phishable until my service lets me actually deprecate password access to my account. And so Google's already out there in front with their advanced protection program, where I, as a consumer, can lock everybody, including myself, out with passwords by opting into that program, and you need security keys to do that.
Lovis, you got some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think this is true of any industry level change you drive. It's going to take time. The point you say we were here before, it's not successful. I think those starting points and those failures are how we got here, right? Those are an important building block. Like 10 years ago, would you have put your money on electric cars?
Right.
Right. Wasn't there, technology wasn't there, but it's there now. I think we have a strong promise in our current set of technologies to push the envelope where passwords become irrelevant. They may not die, they may still be there as a fallback, they may still be there as a fallback with the 2FA. We don't know where we will be in X number of months or years from now. But passwords got to go in their current shape and form, right? Stronger methods are here, they're here to stay.
All right, Dean, you got?
Yeah, I'm with Brett on this. I think for the consumer space, it's really about the customer experience or the user experience of how easy it is, as opposed to a password or a password manager or multiple password managers, whatever the case may be for you. So certainly, I think that's where we can expect to push this. In my own personal life, I've tried to push it on my family with, hey, security, and that's just not working very well.
Brad, we have a chance to get over this hump? And
I'm going to be the optimist here. I think that we're just like this close to a lot of big pieces falling into place. You know, NFC cards are something that people know how to use. They can be deployed at scale very cheaply. Everyone knows how to use them on the bus. People know how to use them to get into buildings. It's just a familiar technology that is used around the world at a very low price point, and we're sort of this close to having it have reach into most of the devices that people are using on a day-to-day basis. And I think when we put those last puzzle pieces in place, the opportunity for big disruptions is going to be really huge, and it might happen really quickly.
Right, yeah, and I mean, I agree with you guys. I feel like we're just, you know, we're ready to cross the line. I mean, it's going to take some time and some patience, but it just feels like we're going to get there this time and solve this problem. All right, we're out of time. I want to thank our panel members for spending some time and giving us their thoughts. Thank you.